this episode of About Sustainability, we talk to Heinz Schandl, who joined us from the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, which is an Australian government agency responsible for scientific research. He's an expert on natural resource use and international resource flows. Among other things, Heinz explained about resource efficiency, the socioeconomic drivers of resource use, and about the possibilities of decoupling economic development and human well-being from resource use. He also explained how resource use is measured through what we call the material footprint, and why it's important to capture the international dimension of that footprint. We also learned about progress in indicators and data availability so that international linkages between resource extraction and final consumption can be tracked and managed. All these items are important for measuring progress across several SDGs, including SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth and SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production. Join us and listen. Heinz, can you explain to us what is resource efficiency and why is it that it's important for national economies, and how do you actually achieve it?
Yeah, no, thank you, Simon, for the question and for having me for this podcast today. I'd like to start by saying that for the last 17 years, I've been with the Australian National Science Agency, the CSIRO, where I'm currently the Director for Circular Economy. And resource efficiency is a concept that actually occurs in the context of the circular economy. And it's not a new concept. We're talking about resource efficiency for the last 30 or 40 years at the OECD, at Eurostat, at the United Nations Environment Programme. Resource efficiency refers to the amount of value and of products and services that we can generate whenever we use a kilogram of material in the economy. And as you would expect from economic theory, the more resource efficient you are, the more you can turn that actually into economic growth. And so that means at the same time, you can also avoid, through efficiency gains, to avoid overuse of materials in your industrial processes. But whilst we can be concerned about the eco-efficiency of production processes, for example, we also need to acknowledge that resource efficiency leads to a rebound effect. So as we are using resources more efficiently and therefore we are reducing cost of resource use, then we can actually also consume more of the products that are made from those resources. And therefore, resource efficiency does not only come with an economic growth effect, but also with a rebound effect. But overall, I would say it's really important for national economies to use their resources productively, which is resource efficiency, in order to ensure economic prosperity and human well-being. But it's only a starting point. It is a necessary condition for sustainability, but it's not sufficient. We need to also then look at consumption systems and at infrastructure to create conditions under which resource efficiency can actually be used in such a way that we're not generating a very large rebound effect that then consumes the gains that we made through efficiency.
So if I understand correctly, the resource efficiency depends on the natural resource use, right? So is that related to the material footprint? And so how do we measure the material footprint of a country or a region or even individuals? And how does it differ from the ecological footprint?
I think, Alice, we need to step back for a moment to explain where all these concepts are coming from. So really the starting point, I would say, is the recognition that GDP does not cover a lot of the social and environmental implications of the economic process. And so around the 1990s, with the notion of sustainable development, we're also starting to think about the amount of resources and the amount of waste and emissions that are generated in the economic process. So whenever we produce and consume, what are actually the environmental beds that come with that process in regard of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and resource depletion? But the question really in the 1990s was, how are we going to measure that? How can we actually tell how much environmental use we have whenever we produce and consume. And the good news was that at that time we already had a lot of foundational thinking. We had the work of Bob Ayres, who had done a material flow analysis study already in the 1970s for the United States. We of course have the concepts of Herman Daly, of scale, allocation, and distribution. Herman Daly, an important economist working for the World Bank, looked at the physical scale of the economy vis-a-vis the environmental system. And so based on those theoretical underpinnings and the idea that as a society, we're operating an industrial metabolism, we were starting at Eurostat, the European Statistical Office, and the OECD to look into how can we actually measure the amount of materials that we mobilize whenever we produce or consume a unit of product or service. And so in that context, the idea of material flow accounting came about as a satellite to the system of economic accounts and complementary to the economic accounts, so that we can say whenever we have a dollar in the transport system, a dollar in agriculture, a dollar in mining, what is the amount of material that we're mobilizing at the same time? And the reason this was important was because we had to assume that every kilogram of material that we use comes with an environmental impact. And while the environmental impact of a material can be quite different, whether we are, for example, using sand and gravel or whether we are using chlorine, they have a different impact coefficient, if you like. Overall, every kilogram has an impact. And we could actually measure that through a combination of material flow analysis and life cycle analysis. And so we started to develop headline indicators that actually tell us how much material is used in an economy in 1 year. And we looked at everything: biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, and non-metallic minerals. And we established national indicator sets to demonstrate the amount of material that is mobilized, and also develop headline indicators that could then be looked at together with a national account, like how much GDP in a year, 3% growth, but how many resources have we used at the same time? And that gave you an indication of our incursion into the environmental systems. Now, the problem that we then had is that as countries started to engage in policies that were aimed at reducing material consumption and therefore reducing environmental impact across the board, and we saw, for example, in Japan, the 3R policies and the indicators they were using for their policies, one of which is resource productivity, but also the amount of materials that are managed domestically, what we call the domestic material consumption. It's a misleading name for an indicator, but it's basically the amount of material that we can manage in the national economy, and therefore also can influence through policies at the national economy level. And we looked at countries like Japan and the United Kingdom, who either had a lot of resources coming from abroad through trade, a lot of primary resources, as in the case of Japan, for example, from Australia, but then a country like the United Kingdom, which had deindustrialized, so didn't do a lot of manufacturing. And therefore, there are national indicators for material management. The amount of material that they looked after looked very favorable, and they were actually reducing. And so you could actually argue, or the Japanese government and the UK government at the time argued, this is actually very environmentally beneficial. We are continuing to grow economically, so GDP is on the rise, but our domestic material consumption is actually stabilizing or declining. And we thought we need to look after the process by which these countries are actually outsourcing environmental implications and resource use to other countries through the way they're engaging with international trade. And initially we did that very poorly. But then around 2015, there were already a lot of studies emerging. So we had the work of Stefan Gillium in Vienna, Arnold Tucker in the Netherlands. There were studies also from the Japanese scientific community. And we thought, let's bring all of this together and develop a measure for material footprint very similar like carbon footprint or ecological footprint, which allows you to measure the responsibility of a country, the amount of primary material that is mobilized anywhere in the global economy that is needed for final demand, which is a combination of household consumption, government consumption, and capital investment in the country, and how much is actually needed. And so once we did that, you could actually see that the domestic indicator for the UK and Japan, which would sit anywhere between 10 and 15 tons per capita in a year, would now increase to 25 to 30 tons per capita. And we did not see the same reduction effect that we saw for direct indicators. And that led us to the conclusion in our 2015 paper that we hadn't experienced any level of wealth in any country in the world where actually at that time material footprint was either decreasing or stabilizing. But the footprint is really an indicator for environmental responsibility across the board, very high level. It's a proxy for environmental pressures and impacts, a headline indicator in that sense. And it's also highly correlated with material living standards. So the higher your material living standard, the higher your material footprint, and therefore also the higher the environmental implications of your way of life.
Sorry, just a quick point of clarification. Could you just explain what you mean by primary materials and why you're focusing only on those?
So, Andre, we are not. The footprint concept is not just focusing on primary materials, but it takes the measurement back to the stage when materials are put in motion for the first time. So the point of extraction, the point of harvest, the point of when we take timber out of a forest through logging. So this is the step where we measure. But then the materials are obviously transformed, they are turned into products, they enter consumption, they become disposed at some point, and all of this is included. But we were not just interested in the amount of material that would cross a national boundary as a commodity, a refrigerator, a Toyota car, or something of that kind, and therefore becomes an entry as a tonnage of material embodied in that product in your material flow account. We were interested in all of the materials and the waste and emissions that needed to be expanded in order to get to the point where the refrigerator could be imported. So it's a way of taking it back to the point of primary resource utilization, if you like. And we also know nowadays from the studies of the International Resource Panel that actually 80% of the environmental impacts can actually be allocated or located at the early stages of resource extraction and transformation. So that's a little bit different for different environmental impacts. But more generally speaking, you could say 50% of climate impacts, 90% of biodiversity impacts, and about 30% of pollution impacts go back to this stage.
Thank you, Heinz. This is a really very interesting overview of the material footprint here. And you mentioned sort of the name. You mentioned the term responsibility, and maybe I'm preempting the discussion, but maybe that can lead us to the next question. In your experience, is material footprint always correlated with country level of development or country development level? There are some that argue that poorer countries that do not have environmental regulations in place or do not have the technology to improve their resource efficiency actually have a heavier material footprint than more developed countries where governance and technology is more advanced. Like the environmental Kuznets curve. Can you comment on this?
Okay, there's a lot in your question, right? I'm kind of feeling I should start at the end with the environmental Kuznets curve, right? So obviously the idea of the Kuznets curve is at low level of economic development and human well-being. You're starting to use more resources. Your economy gets dirtier, but you're kind of reaching a peak where you start to really invest in environmental regulation and policies, and therefore you're then reducing impacts over time. And so the richer you get, you will then also clean up your environment. And that's actually true for things that you can control through technology and end of pipe. So for example, SO2 emissions could follow such a pattern. But we're not finding a Kuznets curve shape for material use. Quite the opposite. So the more development you have, an indicator of material footprint really then represents that and is continuing to increase with your economic development. But think about the other part of your question. So say we have a low-income country that has a large mining sector, and they're extracting lots of metals, which they then export almost directly with any value adding to another part of the world, where then these resources are used in manufacturing and industrial processes. So the resource efficiency of that country would obviously look very bad, because their domestic indicator would show a lot of resource extraction, which would be reflected in the domestic consumption indicator. And their GDP would be rather poor because they're a low-income country and there's no value adding happening through one of their main economic activities, which is mining in that case. Now, what the footprint indicator now does, it allocates the resource extraction that had occurred in that country to the point of final consumption, right? So now the metal ores that are extracted in the low-income country become part of the environmental indicator, the material footprint, in those middle and high-income countries that actually manufacture products out of those primary resources. And so therefore, for such a country, the domestic material flow indicator per capita would be very high, but then the material footprint per capita would be rather low. And that would signify a low material standard of living in that country, because the material footprint only measures the amount of resources that service final consumption in that low-income country that is engaging in all the mining activity. But the bulk of resource extraction would then be allocated to the country where the material is actually used in manufacturing, and then as a final commodity at the point of final demand. So yeah, you can actually say with quite some certainty, the higher the level of economic development, ceteris paribus, the higher also for energy footprint and so on and so forth. I think the important question is actually whether we reaching a point where we see some level of decoupling in high-income countries, and what we mean by decoupling is, can we actually see a situation where we have economic growth, but at the same time we see either much slower growth of resource demand, for example, of the material footprint indicator. So say GDP grows by 3%, but material footprint only by 1% per year, or whether we actually see a decline in material footprint. And the Global Resource Outlook, which was published this year, the Global Resource Outlook 2024, published by the International Resource Panel, for the first time actually shows some decline in material footprint in the United States and in the high-income countries of Europe. But you could say that actually also signifies a decline in wealth in those countries, in terms of how wealth is actually distributed across the population of those countries. So you could say the global financial crisis and then also the pandemic have led to a situation where actually the level of wealth in high-income countries has become more unevenly distributed, resulting in lower material living standards for significant parts of population in those countries. And therefore, you also see a bit of a stabilization or decline of material footprint, actually for the first time.
That's very interesting. So basically, you're saying with this comment, or when you're summarizing this observation from the International Resource Panel, that what may look like decoupling at first glance is actually not a decoupling, because there is still a, could you say, parallel relationship between economic development in those countries and the material footprint.
So I think, Simon, like there's lots of concepts out there. Obviously, decoupling is a key concept of the International Resource Panel, but it refers to a number of things. So the Resource Panel talks about well-being decoupling, about resource decoupling, and about impact decoupling. And so when you think about that, then you would say what we actually want to do in the end, we want to achieve human well-being at much lower environmental pressures and impacts. So there's your resource and your impact decoupling. And we're actually looking for policy settings that allow that to happen. So there is a small chance that 9 billion or 10 billion people on the planet can actually live and produce and consume within planetary boundaries, which is obviously the hope that we have. And so now you see in many countries policy efforts, for example, for decarbonizing the energy system. So you're towards net zero policies, your Paris climate agreements, but also increasingly efforts into the circular economy. The idea that we can actually close the loop for certain material supply chains, so that we rely less on virgin materials and use more secondary materials, which can also reduce energy demand and pollution if well done. And if you take all of this together and if you look at the policy efforts, you could actually say some countries engage in significant policy efforts to reduce the environmental consumption of their both production systems, their infrastructure, and their everyday consumption of households. So some countries are more successful in doing that. But then you also have obviously a relationship to economic performance as well. And so it's actually quite difficult and requires analytical tools to detangle what is the policy effect, what is the structural change effect, what is the economic effect of reducing resource demand in an economy.
Okay, so you're saying it depends on what indicator you look at, and if you look at what might be the end goal, say an increase in human well-being, there may be signs that an increase or a steady state of human well-being could be achieved even though the economic growth indicator is not going up at the same time and the material footprint indicator is not going up at the same time, seen through the efforts of moving to a more circular economy or closing the loop of material flow. I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah. So that's exactly the argument or the hope of sustainable development, right? With all the tension that also exists. But as we know, economic growth is not fully correlated with human well-being. So there seems to be a point of per capita wealth where subjective human well-being or even material living standards do not further increase. There's a saturation. It's highly nonlinear. So you could not say, for example, that people in European countries have lower well-being compared to people in Australia and the US because they have lower per capita incomes. That makes no sense, right? So our happiness is not just related to how much money we have. So that's important. The second important thought, I guess, is to say through collective choices, that is policies, we can actually make change, create change. So we can create conditions and circumstances in which we can produce and consume in such ways that are less environmentally harmful. And that's exactly where climate policies, carbon reduction policies, circular economy policies are heading to. So we're basically saying this is not something that's going to happen spontaneously, but it requires ambitious policy settings to encourage a transition of important provisioning systems. So you'll be thinking of the housing sector, mobility, food, energy, to transition those systems so that they can deliver services to people and also businesses in such a way that they're still using less materials and therefore less waste and emissions. And then also we need to look at our social practices in consumption, which are obviously related to the systems of provision. So certain investments in housing and mobility need to come with certain consumer preferences and behaviors, and they're also not just individual choices. They're also, consumption is also a social phenomenon, and then they need to work together. So we're looking at tremendous transformations in high and higher middle income countries to provide those services like housing, mobility, food, energy at much lower environmental impact, to make space for low income and lower middle income countries to actually raise material living standards to a certain level that is acceptable in terms of the social objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so in this very difficult balancing act between countries and between people within countries, with very little experience or knowledge of how do we actually achieve that. So there's no policy blueprint which says if you do this, you achieve that outcome, because you're dealing with very complex systems, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of contestation, interest of different groups in the population pointing to different directions. We can often not agree what needs to be done. Yeah, so it's very interesting, and obviously all the international reports, whether it's the IPCC, IPPES, or the IRP, they're all kind of agreeing we're kind of on the wrong path, right? So I think that's where information such as the material footprint comes in, because it actually allows you to have a high level indicator, a measure where you can set your ambition. You can say, actually, let's aim for moving from 25 tons per capita, 30 tons per capita of material footprint into a domain which is actually more environmentally acceptable. And that in the long term, that will actually enable, if you like, for those people who really prefer economic growth, that will also enable economic growth in future, because if we're not getting the adverse environmental effects under control, it will undermine our future prosperity, and we already see that happening in many circumstances.
If countries, looking at the world as a conglomeration of countries, if individual countries pursue sustainability and pursue the goal of reducing their material footprint, what about losing a competitive advantage against countries that are not interested in doing that? And I guess that can happen at both the superpower level, but also at the developing country level. So that's the one question. And the other one, which, as I say, may or may not be related, is you spoke about policies now, but the other kind of way of approaching it, I guess, very broadly speaking, would be through the market. And the market has probably been a lot better than policy at increasing efficiencies. And I realize that increasing efficiency is not the only part of the equation, because there's this rebound effect that you spoke about. But to what extent should we be paying attention to markets versus governments as a solution to this problem?
So I think more generally for every country, the initial question is in which sectors, in which economic activities do we actually have comparative advantage in order of how we can produce, in terms of cost and other things. And you would then look into how can we turn that into a competitiveness factor when we interact in the global system on the international marketplace. And really the question then would be, does the current linear economic system relying heavily on fossil fuels for energy generation, avoiding to think about the externalities of the economic process at all, does that in the medium and long term actually lead to comparative advantage that can then be turned into competitive advantage? And I think what lots of the literature says, when you look into any study that models the relationship between economic growth and climate and resource use and waste and emissions in future, all of the studies show in the short term you have all these economically attractive opportunities for increasing resource efficiency, and in the long term, investing in those policies and into resource efficiency and reducing material footprint, for example, have better economic outcomes. They're actually economically more beneficial compared to business as usual. And so the idea then is there are important factors of comparative advantage that lie into participating in the energy transition, participating in the circular economy transition, and not to lag behind in that transition. And that's then further strengthened through a policy environment where increasingly your carbon emissions and I think in future also the amount of virgin and secondary materials, or the mix of virgin and secondary materials in your exports, become a factor in the global marketplace. And you see that already in European policy settings, in Japan, in China, that these things are looked after. And so while the carbon intensity of your exports, and therefore of the economy the exports are coming from, are already a factor in international trade, my prognosis would be in 5 years we will also look at the amount of secondary materials that are used in those products. That means the amount of circularity that has been achieved. And in about 5 to 10 years, we will also look at the biodiversity implications of those products that we trade in the international marketplace. So if that's actually all true, then I would conclude that resource efficiency, carbon reduction is actually an important comparative and competitive advantage factor going into the future. But, there are certainly economists out there who think differently. And as you know, for many economists, the physical scale of the economy does not matter. And that means also externalities of the economic process, they're not considered. And that leads me to your question about the role of the market. Whilst we could say, for example, for many companies and businesses, their environmental performance as a piece of comparative advantage vis-a-vis their consumers is becoming more important. You could also say, to the extent that externalities are ignored and therefore prices are not corrected for the environmental harmfulness of the production process, the harder it is actually for companies to do the right thing in regard to looking after the environment, whilst at the same time looking at their economic benefits. And whilst you could say, especially for companies where their material requirements and their waste management costs are actually important cost factors, and there are such companies, that they would look after resource efficiency and eco-efficiency of their manufacturing production processes already. If externalities were properly costed in, that would actually accelerate that focus. And so there comes your relationship, as you would have assumed yourself, between well-designed policy and responsible market participants, which includes consumers to some extent, but there's less, I would argue, there's less power on the side of consumers, but well-designed policy and companies that act responsibly, which is sometimes encouraged by the policy settings, such as in in extended producer responsibility schemes actually could lead to the outcomes that we're looking for in terms of allowing global consumption, that is material footprint and carbon footprint, to stay within planetary boundaries.
So you mentioned several times how policies can encourage countries to reduce their material footprint. But then I was wondering if some countries have taken already decisions, leadership in setting a specific target in reducing the material footprint, and if not, then what could be hindering that? And I was also actually thinking if it would be possible to have a sort of cap and trade system on natural resources use, like we have for carbon emissions, that could potentially incentivize countries or companies to set a limit on how much natural resources it can consume, and then maybe they would have to purchase the right to consume more. So that's just an idea out there. I'm not too sure if that's possible because of the amount of natural resources that we would have to set a limit on, and I guess you would have to kind of set the limit according to how much they can regenerate their biocapacity, regenerative capacity, I guess. Yeah.
So I think at least the first part of your question is who is doing well, right? Are there countries that we can take as good examples? And I think you could say more generally, like the European Green Deal goes in the right direction. And very often we're looking at Europe when we look at environmental policy settings that are actually more conducive to reducing the environmental pressure and impact of production and consumption. But we also find front runners in Asia. So when you think of Japan, for example, and their policy framework for the sound material cycle society, all the efforts around the 3 Rs, which really underpin now the whole discussion about the circular economy. So certainly Japan, a very important global force with regard to driving the policy discussion on resource efficiency on the 3 Rs. China, for example, has a promotion law for the circular economy, and they're now deeply engaged in ecological modernization. I think the way they frame it is actually around an ecological civilization, which is a much broader concept, which then includes not just the economy, but society as a whole. When you look at Australia, for example, Australia is now engaging in a circular economy discussion as well, looking at what can we do in our country to actually reduce the environmental disbenefits of our production and consumption system in the country. So you could say in many countries we now see efforts to go to a low carbon circular economy, and it's obviously very difficult for many reasons. Even in lower and middle income countries, you see at the national policy level a lot of effort. So take, for example, the ASEAN community, where you could say at the national policy level there are lots of policy settings now which are actually pointing in the right direction. But then you also have what I would call the development pressure, right? The notion that that really when you go to the cities, the towns, the regional areas, the need for development is so large that the environmental policy settings are often seen as a second or third priority in the process. So I think we can say there are numerous countries who are doing very well. Many of the national policy elites in many countries have recognized the environmental dimension, the planet dimension of the Sustainable Development Goals is actually extremely important, not just in the long term, but also in the short run, because of the extent of negative environmental implications that we're already seeing. And so there's lots happening. So then you've talked about this not very new idea of can we use taxation to actually influence the way how we're engaging with environment and resources. And since the 1970s, the idea of an ecological budget and tax reform has actually been part of the discussion, of the policy discussion in many countries. I think it's fair to say it has been limited to environment departments. It has very rarely reached departments of treasury and finance, and very few countries have actually engaged in any meaningful policy activity in regard of ecological budget and tax reform. And I think that actually extends to the carbon tax as well. Also the idea to tax carbon emissions as an externality, greenhouse gas emissions as an externality, is actually politically very hard to promote if you then think about your re-election potential as a party who does that. So whilst I would say more generally, we should definitely use the budget and taxation levers to steer away from negative environmental externalities in the way how we produce and consume. It has to be part. It's also a very hard political sell, and there are not many good examples of where this has been successful. But nevertheless, all the international studies that engage in sophisticated economic environmental modeling show the effect of such tax and policy settings are actually very beneficial also to economic outcomes. So, for example, a study that the International Resource Panel did for the group of seven, the G7, some years ago, showed that the positive economic impact of resource efficiency policies would compensate the cost of your greenhouse gas abatement policies. Now that's actually very interesting. Very often we are not thinking about resource efficiency and greenhouse gas abatement as one package, but if we do, it has actually very positive economic implications. And I think it's fair to say that many countries are now on the path of considering decarbonization and circular economy, which is kind of your resource efficiency idea more comprehensively. And that's very positive.
So the benefits, Heinz, would that be like things like job creation, or what would it be practically for someone who's not an economist?
So employment is always part of the picture, Simon. So I don't think any policy proposal that undermines economic growth or employment is actually palatable for anyone, right? So we always have to look at the employment effects, actually also the distribution effects of any policy that we put in place, be it an economic policy and environmental policy. The proposal or the suggestion is that your carbon reduction and circular economy policies have a positive effect on employment, or at least are negligible in terms of employment outcomes. They're not negatively affecting employment. I have to say, with the amount of technology disruption that we see at the moment in many aspects of the economy. So think, for example, artificial intelligence and how that relates not just to productivity growth in the working place, but also to employment outcomes. It's really hard to judge where the whole thing is going. Are we going to see the same level of employment in future? Will we have the same amount of jobs? Who knows? It's not an area where I have engaged deeply with the literature, but it is thinkable that the amount of work that needs to be undertaken at the societal level is maybe not decreasing, but shifting. Like when you think about the importance of the care economy, for example, which provides or requires very different jobs and has very different incomes. So there needs to be also a rethinking of the kind of remuneration that you, for example, get in the care economy. So whether it's hospitals, kindergartens, schools, where people who work in those sectors are usually not paid to the extent they should be paid, in my personal view. And so there are massive changes coming towards us. Some of them really unpredictable, I would say. But there are surely experts out there who can make more well-founded statements in that regard. But employment is always an important factor, and any policy proposal that undermines or destroys employment will be very contested, as we do know.
Thank you, Heinz. I just would like to briefly bring us back to the discussion around the material footprint, and namely that is in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. So
Yes.
I'd just like you to comment on the so-called international spillovers, which I believe is quite related to the material footprint, because the annual SDG index report that the Sustainable Development Solutions Network produces together with the Bertelsmann Foundation, they have for the last several years increased their focus on what they call spillovers. And here, at a very high level, general level, the observation actually is that high-performing countries, in terms of performing well on the SDGs, also have a bad spillover score. That means they have significant negative environmental and social impacts internationally. And so to me, that just seems slightly paradoxical that on the one side, your country looks as if you are doing quite well on the SDGs, but at the same time, you're having those, increasing spillovers as well.
So maybe it's important to say, first of all, the Sustainable Development Goals are really the compass for the future, in my view. So the level of ambition, the level of global ambition that we should actually have in terms of aligning economic development and human development with positive environmental outcomes expressed through the SDGs is very laudable and important. So they should be the guiding star for everyone who works in the policy domain, in my view. And the work of Jeff Sachs and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and the UN in that regard is remarkable and very important. And it's understandable that they're looking for a high-level number, such as the Sustainable Development Index. So I'm not critical about that. That's also a good way to thinking about that. But then when you look about the countries who perform well on the index, you have, for example, the Scandinavian countries, if I remember correctly, when I looked last time, like Finland, Sweden, very high on the index. And as you know, the Sustainable Development Index really starts from the idea of planetary boundaries and the kind of things that can be measured with regard of whether we surpass or stay within planetary boundaries. So in that regard, an indicator like the material footprint then does not feature in the Sustainable Development Index, because there is no one-to-one relationship between the material footprint, which is an overarching indicator of material consumption in the global system, and it relates to a multiplicity of planetary boundaries that can then be measured. And therefore, because you have no direct link, they're not using that indicator. If you correlate material footprint, the material footprint indicator with the Sustainable Development Index, then you get exactly the same result that you get from the spillovers. All the countries that are very high on sustainable development, according to the index, also have a very high material footprint. And that means they have, across the board, also very high impact on global environmental systems.
Yeah.
So their contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution and resource depletion is, relatively speaking, much higher than countries who perform lower on the index. And that's a problem. But that's also a problem that is inherent in the way how the Sustainable Development Goals are formulated. When you think of the goals, in terms of the driver pressure state impact response framework that has often been used by the UN and also by the European Environment Agency as a framework for creating environmental indicators that link the economic process, the drivers, with the environmental pressures and impacts. When you think about that scheme, then most of the SDGs either sit in the drivers domain or are about policy settings that encourage those drivers to actually occur, to achieve the outcomes in terms of human development and increased prosperity. Very few are actually about environmental impacts or environmental pressures or changes in the state of environment. And the tensions in the systems are very large, you know. So I would say we really need indicator sets that allow us to look comprehensively about the environmental implications of achieving sustainable development outcomes. We also look at not just at the national performance of countries, but the internal distribution within countries. We can see, for example, that in wealthy, high-income countries, the distributional outcomes are not looking very good for most of those countries. So that's why Scandinavia performs better on the index, because they also have a better distributional outcome compared to some of the other high-income countries. But overall, we have a distribution problem in most or in all high-income countries. They are also about generational distribution. So it's usually that young people fare much less well than older generations, and then all of this needs to be appreciated. And so when we talk about a low carbon circular economy and sustainable development, we also always think also about what are the distribution effects, where is inequality going in that regard, and that's an important aspect in sustainable development, also for social cohesion that results from the way in which different households can participate in economic growth in the country they live in.
I suppose that, at least in theory, it should now be possible to measure the distributional tensions or the distributional dimension within countries and between countries in indexes or in the Sustainable Development Goals, targets and indicators, at least in theory, so that after 15 years, after a decade and a half with SDGs, there has been some learning, and if in theory there were to be a continuation, we would be better equipped now than we were 15 years ago to measure it.
I'd agree with that. So the progress in measurement has been fantastic, I would say. So let's start like this. The UN has invested in the system of environmental economic accounts, and so there you have your national accounts and satellite accounts for materials, for waste, for emissions, for water use, for land use, and so on and so forth. And so it's actually based on that approach, the so-called SEA framework, SEA framework. You can now measure in great detail the relationship between environmental pressures and economic activity. So which sectors have the greatest demand for materials for greenhouse gas emissions, for example. And through initiatives like the UN Life Cycle Initiative and the information they can provide, we can then also relate environmental impacts to those environmental pressures. So we can also talk about the amount of climate change, of pollution, of life lost through pollution, of biodiversity loss, of habitat disruption. All of this can be measured. And so I think we're now in a situation where at the national level, we have a really good understanding of the relationship between the economic process and environmental outcomes. And another thing that the footprinting approach actually then services or allows you to do is not just to look at national economies, but for example, to focus on a business. And you can, based on economic information about procurement of a business, you can then establish, for example, the scope 3 emissions of that procurement, or the virgin material requirements of that business, or the amount of waste along the whole supply chain of the business operations, right? So we can actually relatively easily, by using environmental input-output, extended environmental input-output frameworks, and environmental extensions, to determine the amount of greenhouse gas emissions and materials and waste that come with every dollar that is spent for different products of different sectors. And so the Gloria multi-regional input-output framework that is run by the University of Sydney, out of the University of Sydney, which we have also used for the Global Environmental Outlook, is one of these large frameworks, among others, where you can actually look at the inter-industry relationships in the global economy and use those as proxies, or as an accounting mechanism for the attribution or allocation of environmental pressures and impacts to the point of final demand. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter whether it's a country, a city, a region, or a business, we can establish that information. So based on this, now the question then is often who can host such accounting frameworks? And for example, the United Nations Environment Program, based in Nairobi, they are in the process of creating a footprint tool for national statistical offices, where national statistical offices can provide their domestic indicators and in return get their footprints calculated. And the reason why this is important is because no single country can operate a multi-regional global framework. But these frameworks exist, and as soon as you have an international organization hosting that framework and guaranteeing the quality of the process, and the UN, the UNEP is now doing that, and they've launched a prototype at UNEA this year. Now we have the ability for national statistical offices to say, we know how much material we extract domestically in mining, in agriculture, in our fisheries, in our forests. We supply that data, and in return, we get back the information on our material footprint, calculated within the global data set and information and infrastructure that is available through the UNEP and the Gloria multi-regional input-output table and the environmental satellites. And I think such efforts will actually make it easier to progress in the policy development. So if I can say this quickly, when we think about the use of metrics, data, and indicators in the policy process, then we could think about a really stylized policy process, which starts with is it okay? Which starts with problem framing. So something needs to be recognized in society as a problem and issue. And the kind of indicators that are provided through environmental accounting often point to such problems. And they can then be used in policy framing, because a societal problem, a recognized problem where we agree we need to do something, still needs to be turned into something that can be addressed by policy. And again, indicators play an important role. They also feature in policy implementation. So whenever we put together policy, we want to have some targets that we want to achieve. Again, we need these kind of data and indicators. And then obviously when we want to monitor and evaluate how well our policies are working, how efficient they are, how effective, again, those indicator sets come in. So in that regard, I think the satellite accounts or the environmental extensions that are created in the SEER framework are actually really beneficial, because they give you headline indicators and they then allow you to dig into the data structure. So when you say, environmental footprint, material footprint, or domestic material consumption is a certain number in a certain country or has grown by a certain percentage over time, we can then look into the structure and say which sectors have actually contributed most. And one of the things the new Global Resource Outlook does for the first time, it looks at the link of a material footprint to provision systems, also for different country income groupings. And so you can actually see how low-income countries are dominated by the provision of food, and then housing and mobility kicks in, becomes much more dominant in middle-income countries, and then really consumer goods start to play a massive role in upper middle income and especially higher income countries. They almost don't feature in the material footprint of low-income countries, but as we get richer, they become more important. And that also relates back to work that has been done, for example, by Julia Steinberger and colleagues, looking at the relationship between the Human Development Index and for example, energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, or material use in the economy. And again, you can see we can actually achieve a high human development across the globe at the level of resources that we use now. So that tells us we really have a distribution problem, not a problem of how much we utilize. And it also shows us that education and life expectancy can actually be achieved at moderate levels of environmental use. But when it comes to the third element of the Human Development Index, per capita income, which relates to consumption, then the more consumption we have, the higher the environmental pressure and impact. So really we're looking at ways, I think also, of how consumption can be provided in a more collective fashion, which then goes back to the provision systems again. So take mobility as an example. If we have investment in public transport, that has very positive distributional effects, but also allows us to reduce environmental impact of that provision service. So yeah, I think we're not in a situation where we don't know enough. We now know enough. We have enough data. The science is actually very clear, and I think there's lots of evidence that also policy is starting to take these things rather seriously, and we can see that both in the climate debate, in the debate around biodiversity and nature positive, but also increasingly the circular economy. So the hope is, as a global society, we're going to turn this around.
Thank you for listening to About Sustainability. Please subscribe at podcast.iges.jp or search for About Sustainability wherever you normally get your podcasts. If you've got feedback, you can review us on your podcast directory of choice or reach out on Twitter at IGES_EN. About Sustainability is produced by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. Any views expressed during the podcast are those of the speaker at the time of recording and do not necessarily reflect the views of IGES. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. We don't take that lightly, and we hope you'll join us next time.